In these perilous times, see from current events how biblical prophecy is coming to pass in front of our eyes. You're watching In the Last Days, the program that looks at Israel and the end times with teaching from a Hebraic perspective. With Martin and Natalie Blackham. Thank you to our friends and partners who make this program possible. Now, here's Martin and Natalie.
Hi, welcome to the In the Last Days television program with myself, Martin Blackham. Natalie is behind the scenes today, but she says hello. One of the things that we've done on the Last Days television program is talk about the bias in the media, in particular with regards to Israel. Now, last week, if you were watching the program, you will have seen we had a very special guest, Dr. Richard Lanz, and he's in the studio again this week. Thank you so much for coming in to be with us again this week, Richard. Richard is an author and a speaker. He's a professor of history at Boston University. He's written for media such as the UK's Daily Telegraph. Many of you will be familiar with the Daily Telegraph newspaper, and also the Wall Street Journal. And he is the person who coined the word Pallywood. Pallywood being the expression that talks about the stories that are fiction but are made to look real in real time in the Palestinian territories. Now, great to have you again with us, Richard. Thank you so much for coming in, and to our viewers really enjoyed the last program. I know they're going to really enjoy this one with your expertise on the bias in the media. And last week we were talking primarily about the rise of global jihad, and we touched on other things as well. So this week, I thought it would be good to start off with perhaps going on to the Abdullah. I think the name is the Abdullah case. And so why is that so important and significant for the media and for this whole Pallywood?
And also for global jihad. So actually, I coined the term Pallywood while working on the Al-Dura affair because I was looking at raw footage from the scene, which was the 30th of September 2000.
We better just introduce
in Gaza. I'll explain it.
Explain the scene.
So you've got this scene in Gaza. It's the second day after Ariel Sharon visits the Temple Mount. There were riots in Jerusalem the previous day, the 29th, and then on the 30th, there's a demonstration. There are demonstrations all over the Palestinian territories, and one in Gaza at Nitzrim Junction, which is sort of halfway down the Gaza Strip. And there's a small Israeli outpost. The soldiers never left the outpost. They were being pelted with rocks and Molotov cocktails and burning tires and so on. And then during that time,
and the Palestinians were covering this. They had cameramen.
Right, and there were in fact very few Western cameramen because the Western cameramen were in Ramallah, where there was a press conference with Marwan Barghouti, et cetera, et cetera. So, for instance, Charles Ondelan, who ran this story about Abdullah, was in Ramallah that day with his Israeli cameraman, and his Palestinian cameraman, Talal Abu Rahmeh, is down there. And what happens is Talal Abu Rahmeh calls up Ondelan and says, I have footage of a 12-year-old boy shot by the Israelis. And he sends it in. Ondelan looks at it, decides that it's real, edits it, and then runs a story about this 12-year-old boy and his father, the target of Israeli fire, or the target of fire coming from the Israeli position. And then the boy seems to die on camera. And by the time I got to it, which was really 3 years later, a lot of analysis had been done showing that, in fact, the scene had been staged.
And it was which channel was this broadcast on?
This was France 2.
Is that a big?
But he gave the footage to every station. Right. CNN, every station got for free this footage, which is really quite remarkable because it's a great scoop. And they all ran it. And as a result, there was a sort of, landslide effect. It was very hard for anybody to say, wait a minute, something's fishy here. So one Israeli investigator says it's fishy. He does an analysis. The media covers him with ridicule and so on. I come in about 3 years later, look at the stuff, and it's pretty clear to me that it's staged. And then I come to Israel. I view Reuters footage from that day, the Reuters cameraman, 2 hours of Reuters footage, and a half an hour of footage from Talal Abu Rahmeh, the cameraman who caught this stuff on tape. and it's full of fakes. It's full of staged scenes where people are, there's a guy running, he throws his arms up as if he's been shot, but he puts his hands out to break his fall. He rolls, people run up, they pick him up, they run him past the cameras, throw him into an ambulance. If he's really injured, he's just as good as dead, and the ambulance runs off. And if you look carefully at the stuff, it's clear that a lot of this stuff is faked. There was one hysterical scene where a guy fakes a leg injury and nobody comes to pick him up, and he waves these little kids who are not going to pick him up away, looks around, realizes that it's not going to work, and walks away without a limp. And at that point I said to Charles Enderlin, I was watching it with Enderlin, I said, wait a minute, this stuff is staged. He says, oh yeah, they do that all the time. It's a cultural thing. So I said, but if they do that all the time, why couldn't they have faked the Al-Dura affair? He said, oh, they're not good enough for that. They couldn't fool me. Well, they did. I mean, I'm taking him at his word that he thinks it's real. They fooled him. If not, it's a whole lot worse. But let's take him at his word. The real significance of this is, I began to realize that that's when I invented the term Pallywood, because I knew that there were fake scenes. I didn't realize that Western media took these scenes, cut them up so that they looked realistic, and then put them on camera. But then once I realized this, I could see it in most of the footage. So this had been going on for a while. This had gone on extensively during the first Intifada in the late 80s, early 90s, and so on. The significance of this story is that it literally had the impact of a blood libel. I call it the first blood. I'm not the only one. Those of us who work on this stuff, call it the first blood libel of the 21st century, Niger Poler, Shmuel Trigano, and so on. So if you look at this, Pierre-André Taguieff, if you understand the impact that this had, it hits not just the Arab world. And in the Arab world, bin Laden immediately takes this stuff and puts it into a recruiting video for global jihad. And it's a central piece in the recruiting video and so on. I heard from a Muslim student in London who through the Muslim Students Association was radicalized to jihad, and this story of Al-Dura was one of the sort of key elements that they showed him. So it was a great recruiting device for global jihad. And at the same time, the Europeans are jumping on this because they think that it clears them of Holocaust guilt. So you actually have a major mainstream French reporter, Catherine Ney, saying this death, I put it in quotes, she doesn't know it's not a death, but okay, this death replaces the image of the boy in the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay, so for her, this death, and Enderlin's presentation makes it clear that this is a crossfire that was started by the Palestinians. They were firing at the Israelis from behind the boy and the father. And yet, this death erases and replaces an image that's symbolic of the systematic extermination of 1 million kids and 6 million Jews, all of them civilians, none of them military. So if you want to talk about moral derangement disorder, this is really an extraordinary moment. And here are the Europeans seizing on this, showing this picture over and over. It's, in the French terms, l'image choc de l'intifada. And every time you turn on your TV, when they do Intifada coverage, it starts with a picture of this boy being shot. So here are the Europeans who are waving this, what they think is a flag of get out of Holocaust guilt-free card, in front of their audiences, and not realizing they're waving the flag of jihad in front of their Muslim populations. And there's no question, I'm doing a study on this, but it's going to take a while. There's no question that from 2000 on, Muslims in Europe get more and more aggressive. You have something that did not exist in the 20th century, in the 21st century, starting with the Al-Dura demonstration 6 days later, in which you have leftists and jihadis shouting death to the Jews, for the first time in a European city. You have the emergence, the taking root, and the spread of an aggressive Muslim street in Europe. And every time there's, during the Jenin operation in 2002, in which reporters are saying massacre, 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 when there wasn't anything even remotely resembling a massacre, you have these demonstrations. So in a sense, the what I call the lethal journalism, which, for example, believes stories about a massacre when there is none, reports this in the West, and it literally provokes these huge, violent, angry manifestations against Israel, which are an open invitation to jihadis. And the last time you saw it was just recently during Protective Edge, where you really had, this stuff spilling out into open violence, pogroms, or just barely averted pogroms against Jews all over Europe.
Do you think that it's an excuse for anti-Semitism? This every time Israel protects itself, and it's an excuse for anti-Semitism in Europe and.
Well, to say that would be to say that this is sort of self-consciously adopted, and I think there are people who take advantage of this. I think initially, I don't think Charles Endelin knew what he was doing. I don't think the people who were waving their get out of Holocaust guilt-free card realized. They were probably too narcissistic to realize what they were doing. But as Marx would say, objectively, whatever their false consciousness, objectively that's what they were doing. They were giving the green light to anti-Semitism and covering it by saying, just because I'm critical of Israel doesn't mean I'm anti-Semitic. Okay? Yeah, but when you compare Israel to the Nazis, when you say that Israel is an apartheid state, you're in fact engaging in counter-empirical assertions which throw open the gates of anti-Semitism, because it not only targets Israel, it targets any Jew in the West who defends Israel. The only good Jews are the Jews who are willing to say, no, Israel is at fault, it's our fault, we shouldn't have done this, we should withdraw to the 67 borders, and then there will be peace, and so on. So any Jew who doesn't do that, any Jew who says, wait a minute, we have real enemies here, and they're really ruthless, is accused of Islamophobia, is accused of using anti-Semitism as a way of deflecting criticism of Israel. I mean, criticism of Israel is, it's a dime a dozen. If the criticism of Islam was 1/10 what the criticism of Israel is, the world would be a different place.
And do you know of other? I mean, this was one particular investigation that you've done. Have you other investigations?
Yeah, I'm setting up a website now on Jenin. Jenin was really the first sort of massive case of lethal journalism. You had a 3-year period where the Israelis were operating not in Jenin, but in the refugee camp. You would think from the coverage that they had destroyed Jenin. In the refugee camp, in an area about 5 blocks square, no journalists allowed. The Palestinians are saying 500 dead, 900 dead. They're lining up civilians and shooting them in the back of the head. There are mass graves, et cetera, et cetera. The media is gobbling this up and passing it on as if it's true for 3 weeks. And then finally, when they get in there and realize that, there are 56 dead, most of them combatants, which for urban warfare is like unparalleled. Americans in Fallujah did not have a majority, so low a death rate and so high a combatant mortality rate. They're still saying, oh yeah, well, there was no massacre, but it was devastating, it was horrible, it was awful, et cetera. And so, you literally have, during this period, 2002, you have crowds in Europe, demonstrations with models wearing suicide belts to show their solidarity with the Palestinians. I mean, these same Europeans are the targets of that jihadi suicide bombing mentality. London would discover it 3 years later, and here they are celebrating these people because they think, oh, the Israelis, the Jews, deserve it. Look at what they did. They killed Mohammed al-Dura, they killed their kids, et cetera, et cetera. They massacre their civilians. No wonder they do this kind of stuff, and we support them. And they don't realize that, in fact, they're supporting a movement that targets them just as much as the Israelis, that considers, for the French, with their experience in Algeria, or the British with their experience with the Muslims in India. There's a lot more Muslim blood on the hands of Europeans than there is on the hands of the Israelis, and yet they seem to think that if they side with the Palestinians, that will make them safe from jihadi aggression. So
Yeah. Now, if you've just joined us, Richard, we've got Dr. Richard Landes in the studio today talking about Pallywood and the rise of global jihad. One of the things, Richard, about the coverage of Jenin, indeed the coverage of the recent conflicts in Gaza, is the difficulty of getting objective journalism, of the intimidation, which is some of it you can find on the internet. That's in Arabic, where Hamas have said you're only allowed to film this and this and this. How much is that an issue when journalists are trying to cover the conflict?
It's a huge issue. Look, it's so enormous, it's so pervasive that a lot of the media don't even notice it. In other words, there was recently an article in the Tablet magazine, which is a very good journal, by a guy named Mati Friedman, who's an American-born Israeli who worked for AP for a number of years. And he wrote, and he said, look, this is how it operates. You cannot tell the Israeli narrative, and you cannot tell negative stuff about the Palestinians. So you're not going to find coverage of corruption. The only time you're going to hear about corruption is when people explain that, the people voted for Hamas not because it says it's going to destroy Israel, but they voted for Hamas because they're anti-corruption and the PA is corrupt. But, you didn't hear about PA corruption before that. So he writes this, and the head of the AP at the time writes a response in which is, well, they only threatened to kill. And it was only one incident. And the point is that there's a huge amount of self-censorship that goes on. So, for example, if we go back to the Al-Dura affair, 12 days after the Al-Dura affair, there's the Ramallah lynching, in which these two reservists took a wrong turn, ended up in Ramallah, were remanded into police custody, and a lynch mob broke in, literally beat them to death, tore their body parts apart, set them on fire, and dragged them through the streets of Ramallah. One of the most savage demonstrations imaginable. And they're yelling, revenge for the blood of Muhammad Adour. Okay. So then what happens is there are film crews there, and they're filming it. They get beaten up. Their cameras are busted. The footage is...
This is
Western film crews.
In Ramallah itself.
In Ramallah. Mm-hmm. And they're immediately... the PA confiscates their footage, and even before the PA gets there to confiscate the footage, there are thugs who are beating journalists up and so on. A guy named Seeger, I think Mark Seeger, wrote an article for I think it was The Independent, called I'll Have Nightmares for the Rest of My Life. And so when he said, I was just glad to get away with my life. And then after he wrote that, he was told by his contacts, because he was very pro-Palestinian, he was told by his contacts, it's not safe for you anymore because you described the Palestinians behaving badly. One crew smuggles it out. It's an Italian crew. It runs. It's a big deal. That Italian crew, the entire network, slept for 3 nights in the Italian embassy in Tel Aviv because they were afraid for their lives. Within Israel, they're afraid for their lives from Palestinians. And then they fled. Okay? So at the same time, the head of the other Italian news agency writes a letter to Arafat and says, you have to understand it wasn't us. We would never do something like that because we always follow the procedures of journalistic practice in the Palestinian territories. And those procedures are very clear. Tell the stories that make Israel look bad. Do not tell the stories that make the Palestinians look bad. Okay? And that is the prevailing demand. You don't get access. I mean, at best, you're kicked out. At worst, something much worse can happen. And we know there are kidnappings and so on.
There was a BBC journalist kidnapped in Gaza.
Right, Alan Johnston. And what was so amazing about that was the Palestinian reaction, which was, hey, why did they kidnap him? He was on our side. Right? In other words, of course, somebody can get kidnapped in the Palestinian territories, but why kidnap somebody who's on our side? Okay? Apparently, it's impossible to be sufficiently on everybody's side in the Palestinian territories. But that, okay, so we go from this situation of intimidation, and this came out really clearly so badly that the Foreign Press Association here, which is normally very critical of Israel, came out with an objection to the intimidation of journalists in Gaza. because the PA is much better at being friendly about intimidation. Hamas is a little cruder. So it finally came out. There was denial across the boards. Jody Rudorin from the New York Times said this is nonsense. You know, the Israeli narrative, now the FPA, Foreign Press Association narrative, is nonsense. Because and essentially what she's saying is not there's no intimidation. I mean, that's what she's saying, but it's clear there is intimidation. But what she's saying is we are in total denial about this. And one of the things that we won't do is adopt the Israeli narrative. And that's what the FPA did, was to adopt the Israeli narrative. And of course, the Israeli narrative is, among other things, that Hamas has a strategy which includes a significant role for the media. They provoke Israeli retaliation. Israelis retaliate, and the media's job is to focus 24/7 on Palestinian suffering, not to focus on what the Palestinians themselves do, what the combatants do, fire from the midst of civilians and so on and so forth, and to arouse Western indignation, hatred of Israel, diplomatic moves to stop Israel. And that's an asymmetrical war strategy. You use the media to assist you in surviving a battle that you otherwise could never survive. And it's very effective. And it's so effective that this time, during Operation Protective Edge, it really became clear you actually had not journalists on the scene, but journalists, commentators, saying, what is Hamas doing? Is it trying to kill Palestinians? Well, alas, yes. Their goal is the more Palestinians suffer, the better it is for them. And it only works if the media blames Israel for that suffering.
And one of the things we noticed in the coverage, Richard, of the recent conflict in Gaza was the fact that reporters would be there on the scene after buildings were all demolished, showing people's houses all destroyed. And also not so much this time I noticed, but one of the things that I've noticed before is that they've been in the hospitals. They wait for all the casualties to turn up. We don't know who these casualties are. There's no explanation.
Right. And I think in those scenes you probably see some Pallywood. In other words, you see kids being brought in. You know, you don't see them for very long, but you look, there's no sign of blood. But a kid being brought into a hospital, that's newsworthy. So at one point, I think it was, it was Michael Oren was following up on Ron Dermer's accusation that CNN and the other media were, obsessing over the suffering of the Palestinians and not covering other extremely relevant material. And the Carl Penhall, who's the CNN correspondent in Gaza, says, I was literally stunned by this, says, I think it's obscene to suggest that we would show pictures of dead babies and of suffering civilians just to make headlines. I mean, you know, the media, no, the expression is if it bleeds, it leads. I mean, what on earth? But this is the kind of sort of indignant self-assertion of a media that is craven and corrupt. Craven because it gives in to the intimidation, corrupt because it won't admit to the intimidation. And what do? They get on their high horse and say it's obscene to accuse us of this.
And we don't even get, I remember in the Iraq War, at least they said, when they went back to the studio, they would say, the reports that we're getting have been censored, or there's a you have to take into account that this is
and they'll do that anytime the Israelis censor anything. I mean, Jody Rudorin, who doesn't believe there's any censorship of reporting from Gaza, had a run-in because at one point the Israelis didn't want her to release some information about a soldier. Maybe he had been killed, maybe he had been kidnapped, whatever, but for security reasons. She made a big stink about that. You get a line, censored by Israeli authorities and stuff. You'll get that all the time. You won't see it censored by Hamas because Israeli authorities will not kneecap you, whereas Hamas will. So you have a situation in which it is, from the reporter's point of view, it is a whole lot less dangerous to tell lies about Israel than it is to tell the truth about the Palestinians. And given that calculus, why not report nasty stuff about Israel? At worst, you're going to get them whining about the coverage. They're not, I mean, the guy who wrote this letter to Arafat saying, we would never do this, we always follow, Arafat published it in his newspaper. And at that point, it became such a scandal that they kicked him out and the rest of the media wasn't going to say anything, even though they all follow these journalistic procedures. But Israel almost never kicks out journalists, whereas Hamas is constantly kicking out journalists. And if you're a journalist and you can't get into Gaza, forget it. You can't do your job. Now, I personally think you can do a better job on the outside, not being intimidated and using sources within than going in there and being intimidated and telling lies in order to be able to stay. But there's a whole literature that doesn't exist, as far as I can make out, in journalism, journalistic ethics, about intimidation. It's not there. You go and you look. I've done some web searching for journalistic ethics statements and stuff. Intimidation isn't there. It's not on their radar. And the fact is that in an asymmetrical war in which the insurgents, in this case jihadis, are utterly ruthless and will kill journalists happily, proudly, right? On the one hand, and a democracy that has all sorts of inhibitions about, interfering with the freedom of the press, you have intimidation as a major player in any coverage of asymmetrical warfare, and yet journalists are completely unprepared to deal with it.
And I think it's something that not many people even know about or have thought about, that
Right.
there's so much intimidation of journalists and television crews and everybody who's covering this recent conflict in Gaza. It's been great to have you with us, Richard. Thank you so much for coming again
Thank you.
into the studio.
You're welcome.
Don't forget you can contact us at info@inthelastdays.com. Visit the website www.inthelastdays.com, and remember, we're living in the last days.
You've been watching In the Last Days, a TV program with Martin and Natalie Blackham, the program that looks at Israel and the end times with teaching from a Hebraic perspective. If you would like to financially support the program or find out about conferences, meetings, or ministry products, then please contact us with the details on your screen. Visit our easy-to-use website at www.inthelastdays.com and register for our free e-newsletter. Get the latest news from Israel, product information, online video teaching, or watch today's TV program at a time that's convenient to you. Thank you again, friends and partners, for making this program possible.
See you same time, same station for the next program from In the Last Days.